People who knew murderers. When did you know something was off? Sat next to him in choir class. He was always kind of off. He operated on his own wavelength, constantly in his own world, never really engaging with anybody. People just didn't really exist on his radar. On a class trip, we slept in the same hotel room and he walked around naked like I wasn't even there. I always assumed he was autistic, but in hindsight it might have been something much worse, like schizophrenia. He never seemed violent, but nobody ever talked to him enough to make that conclusion in the first place. A few months ago, he beat and stabbed his mother to death with a kitchen knife. It was so bad, dental records were needed to identify the body. He cut off one of her breasts and implied in his confession that he ate part of it. He waited until his dad came home from work to show him what he'd done. Claimed he saw a sign from the devil that told him to murder her. That may have been a lie. From what I heard, he was very excited to tell the police what he had done. And from what I do know about him, he might have said it for the attention. He turned himself in, waived his Miranda rights, and confessed to everything. When the cops found him, he was literally soaked in blood. He refused to shower it off, so they had to hose him down before they put him in a cell. He's looking at 40 years in prison. His mom was an amazing woman. She tailored our suits for choir and was constantly volunteering. If there was an event, she was there. She was going to be her town's councilwoman the next year. She loved her son very much. She didn't deserve to die like that. Story 2. Obligatory didn't know him as a friend, but a regular customer in my shop. He would come in after his shift to buy beer and tobacco. On one occasion, he caught and helped us to evict a shoplifter. He seemed friendly enough. Then, a local girl went missing and was eventually pulled out of a river a few weeks later. They announced they were looking for somebody in connection with her death, and it was him. They had CCTV footage of him tailing her through a park, and footage of him buying beer in a shop, still unconfirmed to this day being our shop as they blurred out the surroundings. Anyway, as we had a TV in our shop switched to the news channel as it was a rolling story local to us, we started to discuss the guy. If we saw him on the day she went missing, that kind of thing. We hadn't, but it was at that point when one of my staff, a young girl who had previously said to management she didn't want to work the closing shift anymore because there were too many creepy men around, told us that he used to stare at her when he came into the store in a way that made her uncomfortable enough to not want to be on the floor when he came in. They never got to question him about the murder as he was found dead in a local park a few days later. He had hung himself. Story 3. I went through primary and high school with a guy in the year below me who seemed a little distant. We lived near each other and caught the bus from the same stop. He was a bit of a bully, but it was something more. Like, you could tell he wasn't a bully because he was hurting inside or because he felt threatened in some way. He was a bully because he did what he wanted to and didn't realize it hurt other people. Like the kind of kid who enjoyed pulling wings off flies. Not long after I left my hometown, I heard that he'd been charged with the murder of a 2-year-old. Apparently, his girlfriend at the time left her daughter with him for an hour or so while she ran an errand. He couldn't deal with the toddler crying anymore, so he beat her. He caused severe internal bleeding and she died in hospital not long after. He would have been around 22 when he did it. He was sentenced to 36 years with a non-parole period of 27 years. This happened in Australia around 2014. Yeah, I'd bet the biggest warning sign is when someone is hurting things because they want to, because it brings them pleasure or joy to do it. That is the scariest, because when those dopamine receptors get involved, how can you stop the brain? That being said, it does sound like this guy had some deep-rooted issues, and unfortunately, 36 years in prison probably won't help with that. But hey, I can still hope that some sort of reformation or help is obtained at least. Story 4. I know a guy who murdered a nurse and wanted to be our town's first serial murderer. He bought a murder kit online and stabbed her over 50 times. We'll call him Steve. I knew him through scouts. Now to preface, our scout trooper was pretty laid back. We didn't tend to bother with badges, and the 2 trooper leaders were pretty cool guys. Mostly we played silly games like crab football, built catapults to fire stuff across the hall at each other, etc. You get the picture. We were a little bit of a gang of misfits, but Steve was really weird. First time it came out was when he would do things like where he would get his butt out and dance around. At first it was outrageous and a bit funny, and he kept getting told to stop. When he kept doing it, it got a bit annoying. None of us were keen, after all, to see his bare butt. Then it got boring and then just outright weird when it's not remotely funny. No one wanted him to do it, and he continued. He also used to bring in printouts of super gross adult content, obviously confiscated and thrown away. Again, he was clearly trying to gross people out for his amusement. A few times he was suspended for a week or so, but we were quite laid back, and the troop leaders were good guys, so they probably couldn't bring themselves to bin him off completely. It was a long time ago, so I can't recall all the details, but I recall him being quite childish in mentality, but also very creepy. When I found out, I was shocked but not surprised. Then I remembered I'd played hide and seek in the dark with this guy in a hall with a kitchen full of knives. Story 5. I moved to a new town when I was 19 and was making new friends at my new job. I met this girl at work and she invited me over to hang out with her and her best friend. I went and the best friend's boyfriend was there and the vibes were way off. I was uncomfortable. He was cold and just seemed angry for no reason. They had mentioned to me before he got there that he was always controlling and had hit the girl before. Turns out controlling was an understatement. She came home one day and he was digging a hole in the backyard and she asked what he was doing. He replied, "Digging your grave." He hit her, said if he can't have her, nobody could have her, all of that. So eventually she left him and had to get a restraining order and everything. He somehow persuaded her to get into a car with him on her work break and they went missing for a few days. Turns out he stabbed her to death, threw her into a river, and took his own life. I met the girl only a few times and him only the once, but the fact that I was in such close proximity to someone capable of that gives me chills. She was so young. It was really sad. Story 6. When he said there was. A teenager, his mother, and his stepfather lived around the corner from me. My mother knew them better than myself, but we all thought they were lovely. A couple of years ago, the son went to the hospital several times asking for help. He claimed he had voices telling him to take his stepfather's life, but each time he went, he was released and told to come back. They would give an appointment. A few weeks later, during a small argument, he stabbed his stepfather to death in front of the garden. He turned himself in the next day, and he wasn't convicted, as he sought help before it happened. Instead, he got the treatment he needed. Edit. I see a lot of people wondering if it might have been a defense/planned murder, and it wasn't. The way he ended his life and how the son acted afterward removed any doubt. Just a truly horrific thing to have happen. To not even be in control of your own self and know that it's going to happen. To look for help and essentially be denied it or told to come back later, and then have it not be early enough. All the while, you knew that at some point your mind might break and you might just take someone's life. That's a lot of guilt to have to live with, let alone the mental anguish that comes with just having these thoughts in the first place. Story 7. I worked in a food court in my early 20s. This family would come in pretty regularly. The family stuck out because they were giants. Mom, easily 6'1", Dad, 6'7". They had a few kids. Nothing really stuck out at the time. They never seemed happy, but never fought. They just always looked like they were coming out of mourning. I heard a few years back that the mom decided to leave the dad, and the dad murdered the whole family before taking his own life. Another coworker did something similar. He lived with his elderly dad. He was a super nice guy, but just always had this deep sadness behind his face. His girlfriend broke up with him. His dad's health went south. Everything became too much, so he shot his dad and then himself. Even after hearing that, I felt bad for him. He seemed like a dude with a big heart, and if he just had a day to decompress and someone to talk to, I think it could have gone a lot differently. Story 8. My uncle murdered somebody and is now currently serving life in prison. From my earliest memory, I knew he had some screws loose. He caught his wife at her lover's house, so he shot the guy. He was going to shoot her too, but she convinced him she wouldn't tell anyone. He burned the guy's house down in an attempt to cover his tracks. As soon as the wife could get free of him, she immediately reported him. As far as me saying I always got creep vibes from him, he always reminded me of a poor man's Charles Manson. Story 9. My ex-coworker was a huge jerk who nobody liked to work with. He'd always be on his phone and talking to someone even when he had a customer waiting to order in his drive-thru. The moment I knew he had something wrong with him was when I caught him looking for his dab pen in one of the lockers in the back room. He always used a top locker, but he was searching through one at the bottom, which happened to be my locker for the day. I told him that, so he just stared at me in the face for a second and walked away. Later that same year, I learned that he shot and murdered someone at a gas station. Edit. To clarify, he was most likely trying to steal from me, and the fact that he made up his lie on the fly set me off, not to mention the super creepy stare at the end. Story 10. I never suspected a thing. She was the nicest woman. I even let her babysit my cousin when I had custody of him for a little while. She was my neighbor a couple houses down, and everyone loved her. She grew gigantic pumpkins, was always outside, so everyone interacted with her a lot. And when I moved away a few years later, I was shocked to hear everything from my family and friends who still lived in the area. The story. She was married to a man. I knew him from my time living there too. One day he was just gone and she was all beaten up. She said he beat her up. We always suspected this happened before this incident, and had left her because he got a woman pregnant a few towns over. We never heard from him again, but didn't really have a reason to. She would mention every once in a while that he was still harassing her and was even beat up on another occasion after his disappearance. He was self-employed and didn't really have any family, so no one suspected anything. 3 years later, she was dating another man. While dating this man, the police had been investigating her for stealing money from the grocery store she worked at. They went to the boyfriend's cabin, where they both were, to arrest her. She came to the door, said, "Okay, let me go put on some clothes." The police waited at the door. I obviously wasn't here, so this is just what I heard. And the police then heard 2 gunshots. They run inside, and she had poured gasoline and set the house on fire and then shot her dog, then herself. It took some time to get the house fire under control. Once they did and began investigating, they found another body in the basement that didn't die in the fire, but several days earlier. The body in the basement was her boyfriend. Then they began investigating further and found a blue 55-gallon drum in her backyard that contained her husband. So she murdered 2 people and her dog, and all she was suspected of was stealing from the grocery store. Story 11. The murderer I know was more of an acquaintance or casual friend. He lived down the hall from me and we hung out sometimes, but not just like the 2 of us. Still, we would chill at each other's places regularly. I passed him one day in the stairwell and said hi, and he said hi back, but called me by the wrong name. He was really distracted and kind of awkward. He didn't make eye contact and just kept moving. I remember thinking, maybe we don't know each other as well as I thought. Later, he was playing N64. Yes, N64, it was a while ago, with my roommate when I came home. He apologized and said his mind was elsewhere. A couple days later, there are cops all over the building interviewing people and searching his place. They'd found the guy's roommate with a bullet in the back of his head in an abandoned lot across town. The next day, he confessed. Alright, so if someone calls me by the wrong name, they're a murderer. Got it. Thanks, OP. Story 12. There was a kid I went to high school with who always gave me the creeps. We had a lot of mutual friends, so we always ended up hanging out, and it always made me feel really uncomfortable. Our senior year, he got suspended for like a week because someone had found and turned in a hit list of his. No one really took it too seriously. About 3 years after we graduated, he was in the news for murdering a man in our town that he barely knew. He told the police that he held the man's eyes open so he could watch his life leave his body. Story 13. I didn't. He was the sweetest, kindest, gentle giant kind of guy. Bit of a weirdo, but still a great guy overall. I remember once that he shed a tear just by talking about his kid because he was so filled with emotion from having him in his life. He turned out to murder his wife, kidnap his child, start the longest Amber Alert in the history of Canada as he tried escaping to a different province, and he murdered another man to steal his car. I'm still unsure today if I should have seen anything at that point. It comes to haunt my nightmares from time to time. Story 14. Looking back, I should have known immediately, but I didn't even know what I was seeing. In 2016, I was working as a server, and one of my coworkers was always complaining about her crappy husband and how they always fought. They were from Chicago and kind of just always loud and aggressive, so I didn't think much of it. One night, they both came in for dinner and drinks and sat in my section, and I was looking forward to finally meeting her husband so I could give him a face. I just remember not being able to look him in the eye, feeling super uncomfortable anytime I needed to go over to their table, because my friend would try to spark a conversation and I wanted to talk to her, but the guy's presence just sitting there made my skin crawl. They left that night, but soon she stopped coming to work, and then a couple weeks later, news broke out about murder. It was heartbreaking, and I no longer take lightly word of domestic disputes. Story 15. I knew this kid my entire life. We were friends in elementary and middle school, more middle school. He was your typical redneck kid, but a kind person. Imagine if Pinky from Pinky and the Brain grew up in the rural South. Well, as people do in school, we drifted apart. He honestly wasn't the person in the group I was friends with, he was just in the circle. So we went about our lives. A year after we graduated in the same town we all grew up in, he murdered his entire family. Mother, brother, stepsister, father, just for no reason. Nothing really provoked him, from my understanding. He left and went to ride ATVs with his friends later that day. They caught him and he had no memory of it. He went to court, got life, and never could recount a single moment, at least he said. It was weird seeing this kid who was, to your knowledge, just dumber than a bag of hammers, yet an odd innocence to him, on trial for such atrocities. He just sat stone-faced the entire time, almost like he didn't understand what was happening. Not to say I feel bad for him, but I felt something. Sadness, perhaps. Story 16. Not sure if this fits here, but it's a sad story nonetheless. About 4 to 5 years ago, my mom hired this man to remodel her kitchen because he had been recommended to her by a bunch of people. The day he shows up, he has his 11-year-old daughter with him to help him out. The second I saw both of them, I think he's touching her. I don't know why, I have zero proof, just a weird feeling, and his vibe totally creeped me out. Maybe because she was so young. He mentioned having another girl and a son, and she should have been in school. He brought her over every day for 2 weeks while he did the kitchen. She was seemingly happy and fine, so I just sort of kept that in the back of my mind. Every day I would ask my mom when he'd be done so he could get the hell out of her house because he was just so creepy and I didn't want to be around him. My mom ignored it and told me she didn't understand because he did good work and he was really nice. Cut to about a year later and my mom calls me and goes, "Hey, remember Andrew, the guy who did my kitchen?" I said, "Yeah, why? Did he get caught touching his daughter?" She goes, how did you know that?" Turns out he had been brutally torturing his entire family, not only touching his children, but did stuff like tie his son to a shed outside and make him eat his own feces, and it was all in the name of Christ. They fled from him in the middle of the night, and he's now in prison for the rest of his life. When it comes to really bad people, I feel like everyone mentions getting this vibe around. Well, not everyone, but a majority of people get this vibe. Where does that vibe come from? I wonder if it's just like an accumulation of a bunch of smaller cues that you pick up subconsciously, because that's the best that I could think of. Or hey, maybe truly evil people do just let off an evil aura. Story 17. My biological dad ended up murdering my stepmom. Everyone in my family, my mom and 2 older brothers, definitely knew something was up. He had severe anger issues and was very abusive. Some of the earlier memories I have are of him choking one of my brothers. He even almost choked my mom to death a couple of times. Obviously, my mom was smart and divorced him, as she didn't want to see him take my brothers' lives. Years later, I come home from school and my mom and stepdad take us all to the side and tell us he shot our stepmom and was currently in jail. None of us were surprised. If anything, I was just so grateful my mom left him. It's so strange that I am directly related to a murderer. Story 18. Not my experience, but my grandmother's. She got pregnant at 15 by my grandfather and had to get married, 1960s. He was extremely abusive, and my grandmother went to the police multiple times because she felt like he would wind up ending someone's life, but they just didn't take it seriously and ignored her. He went on later to strangle and beat a 14-year-old girl to death with a baseball bat just a couple of years later. Story 19. The first time I met him. Jose was a friend of my ex, and something immediately seemed off. He was sneaky, always lying and cheating, not good at it because he was dumb, and a total narcissist as well. I told my ex to keep his distance, that Jose would only get him into some crap. Not only did he set up my ex to be robbed, Jose snitched on a bunch of other people and finally snapped on a stranger in a fit of road rage and stabbed him. The guy he murdered was fairly young and a good kid, just wrong place, wrong time. I hope that jerk rots in prison. Story 20. I know one and still keep in contact with him. We all knew he had issues with rage, but we never thought he would have murdered someone. We worked together at this restaurant for a while and we got really close. Like if I wasn't in a committed relationship at the time, I would have dated him. He was super chill, down to earth, and the sweetest person, until something triggered him. He didn't get angry often, but he had triggers that would send him into a rage. He was horribly abused as a child by his father, so there was a lot of resentment towards men that looked like his dad or talked down to him. That's where we bonded, because I was abused by my mother. Thankfully, I had the resources to manage my trauma. Unfortunately, he did not. His parents believed that God was going to cure him. It got to the point where his mother left because his father would pull him out of therapy as soon as they would start making progress, and she couldn't deal with it anymore. He ended up suffering from a concussion about 6 months after I met him. He was helping a friend move and had a dresser fall on his head. After this, he wasn't the same. He quit coming into work and went almost radio silent. We would still talk, but we weren't as close as we were before. At the time, I was moving into the city and he lived in the suburbs, so we had planned on getting together to catch up. A week later, I got a call from my friend at 7 in the morning saying he was in jail for hiding a body. I was shook. After an investigation, they interrogated him and he confessed pretty quickly. He beat his dad to death with a barbell and tried to hide his body in the house. Afterwards, he ended up trying to take his own life, but was unsuccessful, so he just left the house. After he was booked, I sent him a letter to check in on him. He had suffered from a psychotic episode and now only remembers moments from the act. He's now serving 40 years with the possibility of parole after 20. He's medicated and doing really well. Last I checked, he had a few activities he was responsible for managing and he was working through his traumas with a psych. Story 21. My ex. We were middle school sweethearts that led into high school. He was sweet and good to me. We drifted apart but stayed friends. His best friend about a year later made a comment while they were drinking about finding me to be attractive, which led my His best friend about a year later made a comment while they were drinking about finding me to be attractive, which led to my ex attempting to murder him with rat poisoning. He went to jail as a juvenile and got out. He came back with anger issues and we all kind of went our separate ways. The ex moved to Florida and next we heard he was in jail for murder. Like most bad Florida-related stories, he got hooked on ice. Met a girl, and in their desperate attempt to keep their habit going, they targeted this elderly couple. They broke into their home, tied them up, and raided their house. They gave them PIN numbers and anything else they thought of value. In their drugged-up, ingenious minds, they decided that this elderly couple saw too much. He dug a huge hole and threw the elderly couple in alive. He buried them. Once they felt the job was done, they took their ATM card and was able to get $200 from it. That was it. That was how they were tracked, too. He's currently on death row for 2 counts of murder and a slew of other crimes, including kidnapping and robbery. And that, folks, is the story of my ex, the double murderer. Story 22. Kid I went to school with from 5th to 8th grade. He was always a jerk. Typical class clown, but with a mean streak. When we hit middle school, he was always making comments about / 2 girls that were incredibly inappropriate. I never liked him and hated being around him. He ended up getting into ice and shot his mom and dad in their sleep while high. His mom died and his dad survived but was severely injured. Last I heard, he was crying crocodile tears saying he regrets everything and wants another chance. But knowing him, it's total BS. He deserves to rot. Story 23. I've worked with 3 murderers in my job supporting people with disabilities. All 3 had varying degrees of learning disabilities, and honestly, only for one of them did I know something was up. He worked out a plea deal as his disability meant that he appeared to lack mens rea and fitness to plead. It was as I was taking him home after all of the investigation was over, he turned to me and said, "Don't tell my wife about this." It was at that exact moment I knew he knew what he'd done. The other 2 incidents, one was so traumatized by what she'd done that she never recovered. She'd been in prison for 25 years and was broken when she came out. The last was a couple. Another vulnerable adult had gone missing. They even helped with the search teams. They were in bits, really concerned for the welfare of their friend. Went on TV for an appeal for her to come home. She was under their bed the whole time. Story 24. I have 2 scenarios that are similar enough to mention. 1. I went to the same high school as the chick who gained infamy in the US for convincing her boyfriend to end his own life and then running all these charity events for him before getting caught. The text messages were public record and absolutely chilling. I think she ended up getting off with manslaughter, but the case is being appealed and will likely go to the Supreme Court. She was extremely forgettable in high school, nothing remarkable whatsoever. 2. While I was in college, I worked in the bookstore over the summers. I worked with a guy there who was a decent guy, but always a bit weird. He'd make inappropriate comments about some of the students that would come in for books, etc., but seemed harmless. He ended up being charged for attempted murder after stabbing his wife multiple times. I believe an affair was involved. The only reason the poor woman lived was because a construction worker saw the attack and intervened, so shout out to that guy for having balls of steel. Story 25. It probably doesn't actually count, but I want to tell it anyway. We, my partner and I, had some neighbors moving across the street. A young couple in their 30s. The guy would come over almost every day to chat with my partner. My partner told me he would say things about being assaulted by his brother as a kid and that people didn't care about him. His wife was weird. She just sat on the porch not talking to anyone or doing anything, just sitting there. All I knew about her was she didn't have custody of her kids. A few months ago, our street was filled with cop cars and ambulances. Being the nosy jerks we are, we just watched out the window for hours as cops busted down the door, screwed with the couple's lawnmower, and eventually we watched as 2 body bags were loaded up into a vehicle right in front of our house. Turns out they'd taken their own lives, or I guess one of them murdered both of them with consent. They turned the lawnmower on in their house and died from the fumes. Their dog died too. My partner and I felt so bad for them because the landlord dumped their stuff into the street the day after and only one person came by grieving. We also felt angry at them for murdering their dog. I tried finding the obituaries but couldn't. Months after this happened, I was on Reddit and saw a video, unrelated, of a man beating the crap out of a registered offender who was talking to his daughter. I went to Family Watchdog just to see, and guess whose mugshot came up? It was her, the wife. And she had a different last name than I thought she did. So I googled her name to see if she got an obituary, and she did. There was also a news article about how she and her ex-husband assaulted all 3 of their own kids and only spent 4 years in jail. The man who did it with her is still out there somewhere. I mean, I knew she was weird, but damn. We didn't feel as bad for them anymore. So, yeah, that was an emotional roller coaster. Story 26. I knew someone when I was in my early 20s in India. He was a dirtbag, but a fun guy under the right circumstances. I made sure to talk with him and be as pleasant as I could, while keeping him at arm's length. I moved away, and then my mom tells me several years later that he and his 4 brothers were hired murderers. Apparently, 2 people got into a fight over a property, and one of them hired these bunch of thugs. They waited for their victim to get home, get changed, and relax when they exploded an oil can in front of his house. When he came out running to see what was going on, they threw red chili powder in his face to blind him and chopped him to bits with large sickles. Apparently, the body was in multiple pieces at the funeral. I knew the victim as well. Guy had 2 daughters. Freaking crazy. OP, you must have felt pretty justified in your decision to keep him at arm's length, huh? I guess there is a difference between a hired murderer and someone who does it for sport, I guess. But still, personally, I wouldn't want to interact with either. Story 27. It was my brother. He died when I was 13. He was 18 at the time. I knew he was capable from the time I was 6 and he was 11. He used to play death games. He would sit on my chest, use his knees to hold down my arms, and suffocate me until I passed out, then wake me up and do it again. There were days where he did this for an hour or more. That's on top of the other kinds of abuse, any you can think of. I was regularly assaulted, beaten, and suffocated for a year. One time he made me stand in front of him while he punched me in the balls repeatedly. He wanted to make me a man, and wouldn't stop until I didn't flinch from the pain. I couldn't tell any of this because I was more afraid of him than confident my parents could or would do anything. He was my primary babysitter. After that year, he moved out. My mom worked nights and my stepdad was a truck driver. One night, my brother decided that he would feed me garbage. He cracked an egg onto a plate, put coffee grounds and other crap from the garbage can onto it, and when I refused to eat it, he put salt and pepper on it and said, "There, now it's more appetizing." The resulting mess was still there when my mom came home, and she wasn't happy. She told us that if we both couldn't keep the house clean, we weren't allowed to eat her food. He balked at this and moved in with another family. I was finally free for a short time, though I didn't eat anything but school lunch for 2 days, and my uncle found out and put a stop to it. Anyway, from 12 to 18, my brother got into a lot of trouble. He was arrested multiple times for assault. He was in and out of alternative programs like Outward Bound and boot camp. Finally, at 17, he was sentenced to 2 years in juvenile detention. He spent a year in and came out to live with a preacher in another nearby town. Eventually, they convinced the parole board that he was rehabilitated and, over the objections of our local police, let him off all probation and parole. That preacher introduced him to friends of his who my brother eventually moved in with. He also met a girl. They met right before summer started, and he was in love. To her, it was a summer fling. When she broke up with him, partly due to his controlling/abusive behavior, he lost it. He came back home one weekend to meet up with some friends, and he also came to see us. Later, my mom would say she knew something was up with him, but that's all hindsight. Sunday night, he went back home. Monday night, he murdered his 3 roommates execution style with a gun he got from a friend that had perpetrated a burglary of our local hardware store. He also stole one of the victim's cars. He then drove 8 hours to where his ex was in college. He arrived pretty early Tuesday morning and somehow got into her dorm room. Tuesday morning, he found his ex and shot her in the foot, threatened to murder her, and then locked him, her, and a few of her dorm mates in a room. A 6-hour hostage standoff with police ensued. Eventually, he stuck his head out the window one too many times, and a police sniper shot him right in the neck. He tried shooting at the cops as they stormed in, but he was dying. He died later in the hospital, and my family became national news for a short time. When did I know? Well, I knew the moment I was 6 and the bad times began. I thought I would be his first victim. The day he died was the first real day of my life. A day without terror. Yeah, I guess being horrifically abused by someone for multiple years would be a pretty good indicator that they are going to do something terrible when they grow up. OP, I just want to say I am genuinely horrifically sorry this happened to you. No one deserves to have a childhood like that, and no one deserves to have to live in fear constantly. With all the warning signs that were there, the fact that no one could really do anything about it still is heartbreaking. Story 28. I had a friend who, for some unknown reason, stopped taking his medication. I think it was for bipolar schizophrenia. Anyway, he ended up stabbing his mom and little sister to death and drinking their blood. Later, after he had been arrested, they found him eating and drinking his own feces and fluids, babbling about how their menstrual blood sustained him. He got back on medication, and the state said he was mentally fit for trial, and they convicted him. I don't even remember for how long. I just thought the entire situation was wrong. It's kind of crazy how 1 month you know someone and they're just normal, laughing and living their life, and the next, they're doing something terrible. Edit. Looked him up to find the details. He was sentenced to 80 years in prison. He used a carving knife and a fork in the murder. His sister was only 6 years old. Story 29. Unfortunately, I know a few people who have committed murder. The one I knew was crazy from an early age was the guy we'll call Biggie in the neighborhood. He was always crazy. He legit thought he served in the deep jungles of Vietnam. He was like 2 when it ended, maybe 5 years ago. He legit thought he served in the deep jungles of Vietnam. He was like 2 when that war ended, and maybe 5 years ago he went to some rehabilitation jail for murdering a bunch of dogs. They let him out on a day pass. He didn't return, and he beat a well-known gay activist to death at the bar that night. He's been released since then, and he lives back at his parents' house. I know for a fact he will do this again. Edit. I'm not a doctor, or as someone pointed out, from the future, so no, I don't know for a fact, but I hope he doesn't at least. Story 30. There was this guy who stabbed a young brunette woman 37 times and then assaulted her post-mortem. It turned into a cold case for 9 years. They finally caught the guy a couple of years ago. Crazy thing was, I, a young brunette woman, worked next door to the bar where this guy drank every night. I also was a raging alcoholic and got blacked out drunk and walked home from there on and off nights regularly. That was almost every night, too. Almost 2 years sober now, thank God. However, I knew something was off about this guy the minute I laid eyes on him. I read people like a mother effer, and I just knew he wasn't someone to know. I talked to everyone who frequented that bar, but I never had a single conversation with him. And if I was out on a smoke break while he was outside, I just never felt like I could turn my back on him. When they arrested him due to one of his relatives adding their DNA to a genetic testing site, I straight up got chills down my spine for the first time in my life. Crazy thing was, I wasn't surprised. I was just surprised I knew from the minute I saw him. Story 31. My neighbor and first sort of boyfriend ended up running over his girlfriend's mother after stealing her money for drugs. He was always a bit controlling and a lot out of control, but as soon as he started doing serious drugs around 17 was when he became a serious concern. He ran away from home and disappeared, only for his mom to get a call that he had murdered someone. I think it was ruled as manslaughter though, since there wasn't enough evidence that he intended to murder her. Story 32. A kid in high school murdered his grandmother one day before school. I didn't really interact with him much. We weren't in the same grades, so we didn't have many classes together or any mutual friends. But I did remember seeing him quite a few times as I was working in the library during my lunch periods that year. Just a quiet kid, didn't talk much. He would sometimes just be sitting there and get frustrated at himself or whatever he was doing and kind of flip out a little. Like a little bigger than, "This math problem's really ticking me off," and a little less than full-on flipping out. But it would seemingly be about nothing. He wouldn't have any pencils or paper, so I don't think he was doing any homework when he would do this. And sometimes he would have a book in front of him, but also again didn't really pay too much attention. But yeah, one morning he just took his grandma's life with a lamp before school. I forget the reasoning. I think it was something like she caught him sleeping in and he went crazy on her. Extremely sad. And I went to a really good school you had to test to get into, so he had to be kind of book smart at least. That was devastating though. Story 33. This kid I went to school with from 7th to 12th grade was always a huge jerk, shouting random stuff in class to annoy the teachers, just goofing off in destructive ways, etc. One day I was driving my gay friend home from school and we're sitting in the parking lot. The troublemaking kid came up and banged on my car window. I thought he needed something, so my friend rolled the window down a bit. This kid looked my friend in the eye, dead serious with more seriousness and hate than I'd ever seen in him. He called him a slur and then walked away. We were so shaken, like the whole world stopped. I felt so bad for my friend too because he already had to deal with his family stuff, and I stayed the hell away from that kid after that. 2 years into college, I find he's in jail for most of his life for murdering his mom in cold blood. Edit. My apologies that this isn't clear. A bit of clarity. The troublemaking kid is the one who murdered his mom. My friend is fine. Everything that OP said kind of adds up to this kid was like really a jerk or whatever, but murderer is still kind of wild. I think that part must come in with what OP said about the kid having more seriousness and hate than he'd ever seen in his life. It's once again just that vibe or look that someone has that really unsettles you. I still wonder what that is and how we as people know. Story 34. Honestly, I didn't. Son of a wealthy family. We were really good friends growing up. He would invite us all over to his awesome game room to play Warhammer, and would use his massive allowance to buy us Warhammer boxes just so he would have more people to play with. He ended up getting his own house right after high school, and we all hung out there for movie and video game nights, and gladly shared spare bedrooms he let us crash in when we needed a place to stay. He's now serving 300 years for 4 counts of assault and a murder. Apparently, he murdered a girl during a bout of extreme breath play, and when she passed out, he prioritized his own needs before her to get an ambulance. We had absolutely no idea he was capable of doing such a thing. Really shook me up. just knowing I hung out with him so much and he bought me so much great stuff that defined my high school years. I still have the Warhammer figures in a closet. I'm tempted to throw them out sometimes just to fully remove him from my life, but at the same time, I remember these figures brought a ton of great memories with my other friends who have murdered less people than he did. So when I look at them, those great memories are the ones that come to mind. I see the endless summer afternoons of all of us painting figures and tearing up the tabletop together. I don't see the guy who bought me the box they came in. Story 35. Played Dungeons & Dragons with a guy on deployment for a few months while I was in the Navy. We hung out in the same group of people. I stopped playing because he kept trying to assault all the female NPCs/player characters. When we got back from deployment, the FBI and NCIS were pierside waiting for him. Him and some other guys had assaulted and murdered a woman whose husband was on deployment. Also had some friends who tied up an old man who they suspected of touching one's younger brother when we were teenagers. They tortured him for hours and then murdered and tried to burn the body. 2 got life. The other turned evidence and only served a few years. Had another guy I was pretty good friends with get arrested by ATF for trying to blow up the car of our local ADA. He bought fake C4 from an undercover agent and they swarmed him while he was trying to push the switch. As I write this, I realize I've been close to some really messed up people. Maybe I'm the one who isn't right. Story 36. I knew Esteban Santiago. Not intimately familiar, but I worked at the hostel he lived at before he flew to Florida. He was very reserved and talked to himself a lot. He didn't seem crazy, even for the crew of misfits that we all knew and loved at the Kupkujiak. I was working the night he took a little Pelican gun case and got in a cab to the airport. He just stared at the ground and nodded as he walked out. The next day after he made the news, the FBI shut the place down and combed through the dumpsters for evidence. Weird and crazy stuff. I would have bet money 2 other regulars were far more likely to go on a murder spree. Edit. The other 2 I had in mind are these. A guy who got arrested for stabbing someone and threatened to stab me because I told him not to threaten to stab the guests. The other guy was a guy who worked the slopes and had literally 0 friends, acquaintances, associates, or family alive. I thought this guy was mute for the first week I knew him. I thought I knew what a loner was before I met this guy. Story 37. I knew a guy a few years ago that was pretty much a walking version of r/I am very badass. On social media, he was an endless barrage of selfies. Some were of him holding his knives and guns, just wishing someone would try him. Others were him shirtless in the bathroom showing off his satanic tattoos. He wasn't one of those humanist Levian Satanists that don't actually believe in God or the devil. He believed the Bible was real. He just chose to worship Satan. He was also a violent drunk who hated women, but that never seemed to stop women from dating him. I always thought it was strange that whenever he got a new girlfriend, a lot of his exes would come out of the woodwork trying to warn the new girl that she should stay away from him. This happened all the time. When he got to his last girlfriend, it was business as usual. One day she had enough and called the police to report him getting drunk and slamming her against the wall. While she was on the phone, he went to get his gun. I heard the 911 call. The last thing you hear is her saying, "He's coming back now," and then screaming. They found her body in the neighbor's yard and his in the front doorway. Story 38. In my case, I grew up knowing the family, so it all seemed normal. But even as a teenager, I could see there was something wrong with my friend's dad. A big group of us were going to a school dance, and the dad asked for a kiss before we all left. And the dad bit his son, and he was bleeding for a while. It was all shocking and upsetting, but it was soon forgotten because he had done increasingly terrible things in front of us. So the abuse ended up being kind of normal. His second wife used to babysit me and my brother when we were little, and we lived on base. My mom said she helped that woman leave in the middle of the night with her 2 babies at the time, but left the 2 older kids with the dad from another marriage. When my mom got out of her abusive relationship, we were beyond poor. She was working 2 jobs. I remember not eating sometimes at the end of the pay period. That man drew up a contract that my mom would marry him and they wouldn't have to sleep with each other until she learned to love him. Then went out and gave me and my brother the best Christmas I ever remember to try and bribe her. Luckily, she wasn't fooled. Later, when we all grew up, my best friend at the time dates the younger brother, and the older brother went off into the military and got a dishonorable discharge for steroids. Me and my stupid teenager self dated the older brother after he got booted from the military, and all 4 of us moved down to Florida for a time. What I noticed is how they begin to isolate you, turn you against others, turn you against your best friends, your family. When the dad would come to visit, everything is a big family secret, no matter how mundane. My best friend and I had enough of the isolation and abuse, so we took my car that I begged my dad to buy me and left. They caught up with us in Tennessee as we tried to get home and followed us the whole way back to St. Louis. Finally, they left when we were back home with our families. While we were gone, the dad remarried and had a baby. What I gathered after the fact is she was planning on leaving and taking the child. He manipulates his 2 damaged and abused sons to help murder this woman and make it look like a drowning at the Lake of the Ozarks. I went to the funeral with my mom and we knew then. The dad didn't talk to his wife's family and sat next to us the whole time. When it was my turn to view her, I got this feeling of dread. His 2 sons had gone back to Florida and were not at the funeral. When we left, my mom and I sat in silence at an Outback steakhouse. We were sure she was murdered. Ends up, he had his oldest son, the one I dated, help hold her underwater while the other son who dated my best friend watched the baby from the shore or a house nearby. When my old boyfriend went back to Florida, he confessed to his mother and his girlfriend at the time and turned himself in from the guilt. Abusive people are manipulative and hold many secrets. You always know what they are, but it happens so slowly over time that you don't understand the scope of their malicious intent. I have a lot of sympathy for those boys, I think. They committed horrific, awful acts. But man, if their circumstances in life did not lead them directly there, like breaking a cycle of abuse and being under control of someone abusive and manipulative, especially when that someone is your father, who you've known since you were born, presumably, yeah, knowing right from wrong is, more difficult in those circumstances. Story 39. Was friends with this one guy I met in high school. Long story short, he murdered another friend of mine. When his name came up as a suspect at the time, it took me back to when me and him would go on about different murder cases and how he studied the Zodiac murderer. We used to talk about how we would dispose of a body if we had murdered someone. I grew up on a lot of true crime because of my mother, so at the time, didn't raise any red flags. I just thought he liked true crime like me. He did like true crime like you, OP. He just also was a reenactor. Story 40. A boy I went to grade school with used to wet himself constantly. He always tried to hang out with me. Our mothers worked together as housekeepers at a nearby resort, and sometimes they brought us with them when they couldn't find childcare during school vacations. He would go through 3 or 4 pairs of pants while we were there. I also was in his group during a summer rec program, and he would run fully clothed into the pool when it wasn't our turn. He pretended it was an accident every time, but I knew he was trying to cover up the fact he'd wet himself. On the playground, he would go up on the hill behind the school and lay out in the sun with his legs spread, hoping it would dry before recess was over. I felt bad for him. I had enuresis at night until I was 14, so I kind of understood. Obviously, his social life was more affected by his incontinence. He ended up becoming something of a bully. He would get really mad on the playground or in gym class if someone beat him fairly, and he would swear at them and try to pick fights with them. Then he moved away, and 10 years later I read in a newspaper that he had murdered his girlfriend while she was asleep. She had a daughter who was only 1 or 2 years old. A few years later I read an article about the link between enuresis and homicide. Apparently some studies had been done that showed enuresis was one of the 3 major warning signs that someone might commit homicide later in life, as it may be indicative of stunted development of the amygdala, a part of the brain that partially controls bladder function but also enhances emotional learning, conditions fear responsiveness, and amplifies external stimuli. Edit. I just looked him up to see if he was still in prison, and apparently he has taken his own life. Story 41. A friend of my mother stabbed his boyfriend to death who was her even closer friend. He called her after the murder to ask if he could take a shower at our house. Realized something was off in that moment. Before that, I actually liked him. My mom told me later, though, that he would make inappropriate comments about my brother and I while we were in high school, which is why she never invited him over to the house. So that's probably when she noticed something was a little off. Story 42. Girl I used to work with 10-some years ago was murdered by her ex-boyfriend. He tied her up to make it look like it was self-inflicted, but according to her parents, the autopsy said she was dead before she was hung. Dead people don't hang themselves up. She also had no ideations as far as anyone could tell. Happy girl with the dreams to finish her degree. Had just bought herself a new car and house and was starting to date again. Police just filed it away like nothing happened, though. Gotta love small towns. Anyway, he was always off. He was your typical narcissistic, controlling, abusive SO. She constantly had bruises and scratches from his explosive violence. He sent her death threats at work, harassed her coworkers, threatened violence to her family and friends, all of it. A week before she was found, he had broken into her house and almost strangled her to death. No surprise he would murder her with the violent temper he had. He began dating another one of my coworkers some years later. We who knew his first girlfriend warned her constantly of what he was like and what we suspect he did. She told us the old sob story of, "He's changed." Apparently, he was a great boyfriend, until he chased her and their 2 kids into the bathroom with a knife, barricaded them in, and set the trailer on fire. They're freaking lucky to be alive. The neighbors had called the police after hearing some yelling and threats, so they were able to get out, but I think the whole trailer burned down. They stayed together and had another kid, but I'm pretty sure she's not with him anymore. Story 43. I am the survivor of an attempted family annihilation. I didn't like my stepfather from the moment my mother introduced him. Every time I was around him, I was just afraid. Constant dread. My stomach and chest would tighten, and I'd feel like I couldn't breathe. He had these blue eyes that looked like something you'd see in a taxidermy animal. No life in them. I didn't tell my mom because I wanted her to be happy, and I was afraid she would think I was being dramatic and dismiss it if I tried. He started beating us both shortly after he moved in. They got married in May of '96, and he murdered my mother and tried to murder me in January of '98. He's still in prison. He last came up for parole in 2012, and the board was evenly split as to whether to release him or not. I'm pretty sure they'll release him next time he comes up in 2022. Story 44. My dad is from a small village in India, and apparently there was a disagreement among two families over farming. Two brothers from one family tried to attack the other family with swords, and the other family shot them down. All this happened in the middle of the village, and my dad was 7, and he saw all of it. Apparently, the two brothers are somehow related to me. Also, apparently, the two brothers challenged other family to a manly duel with swords, and they quite literally brought guns to a sword fight. Both families were quite prideful, so my dad said he knew something like that would happen. Story 45. As a kid, 13 at the time, I had a friend whose older brother, about 19, was known and respected for his gangster lifestyle. He was nice to everyone except for my older brother, whom he had fought with a lot growing up. My brother knew something was evil about the guy and didn't trust him. Even though it ruined my brother's social life, he knew that there was way more at stake than just losing his social life if he kept hanging around. Nearly 20 years later, I'm at a friend's house buying some weed. There's a big, roided out guy there rambling on and on about having to silence some witnesses. He described how him and a friend hid in a person's bedroom closet and waited until they were sleeping to terrorize and threaten their lives if they testified. He described how him and a friend hid in a person's bedroom closet and waited until they were sleeping to terrorize and threaten their life if they testified. He ended up saying his name and my heart skipped a beat. It was the same guy. I texted a friend in the room with me warning him to not call me by my last name as it might set this guy off. It was nerve-wracking to say the least. A narcissistic psychopath. Being in his presence set off fight or flight responses big time. Options of escape quickly filled my head, and within seconds I was ready to jump out of a second-story window onto concrete to get away from him if need be. Fast forward a couple of years and the guy's found guilty of murder. Apparently he stuffed his victim into a barrel and left it in a creek. Story 46. He was the son of my dad's coworker/friend. Before my father got laid off this year, they had worked together for 32 years, so we did occasionally see each other while growing up. The son was my age, went to the same middle school and high school as me. I know that he had some kind of mental disorder involving impulse control. For example, on his way to our middle school one day, he saw a baseball bat lying on a front lawn and decided to use it to smash in the windshield of the car in front of the house. He was also obsessed with death and would talk about wanting to see someone die. Obviously, I wasn't a big fan of him. Did not want to seek out a friendship. A friend of mine, still my best friend today, felt bad for him and would talk to him before classes and such. One day, she was pulled into the principal's office and told that they found a list he had made of people to not murder in his imagined school shooting, and she was on it. I'm not sure what happened with him after that, but I didn't see him again until high school. After graduation, I got a part-time job at a corporate office downtown where I was tasked with making lunch runs. The local restaurants where I would pick up food had a missing persons flyer for a boy my age. He was mentally handicapped, and his family was worried that he had wandered off into the desert, according to the diner staff I talked to. A few weeks later, I see my old classmate's mugshot on the local news. He had murdered the missing boy. Apparently, he and his small group of friends had befriended this kid and driven him out into the desert one night. My old classmate shot him with a crossbow and then slit his throat. Story 47. It was a gradual progression of crazier behavior. My ex seemed normal at first, but a little narcissistic about how great he was, and how confident he knew people. He also claimed that he knew what was going to happen. He told me I would always be his. I laughed and said, what if we break up, I marry someone else and have kids? He said it didn't matter, that I and that kid would be his. I thought maybe he thought it was romantic, but it creeped me out. A month or two later, we broke up. I moved far away and got married. I knew his sister, and she told me how he kept saying I will be his no matter what. Something in that moment made me believe he would find me and murder my SO. Like, you never want to believe someone would murder, but my instincts told me to be afraid. Luckily, it seemed his interest in me had died down over time. I eventually, in my life, realized I was a transgender male, got help and hormone therapy to transition. Once he heard through the grapevine, he seemed officially put off altogether, which gave me a feeling of relief, really. In 2018, about 2 years after coming out, I got a phone call from an old mutual friend. They asked if I heard about what he did on the news. Of course, I hadn't, but I had a bad feeling. He apparently worked at the airport and kept trying to ask a woman out who had a fiancé and a child. She refused him many times. Then he waited outside of her home for her fiancé to show up. Once the fiancé drove up, he ran up to the driver's side window and shot him. The fiancé didn't survive. My ex didn't make it far before he was caught by the police and thrown in prison, likely to be tried for life since he lied in wait. That poor woman lost her love and father of her child because of his sick, twisted version of his own reality. What the hell did he think was gonna happen? She was gonna fall in his arms once her husband-to-be was murdered? I think it's important to acknowledge that there's no way to really tap into the mind of someone like that. Trying to rationalize their behavior will never make sense. Delusions are called delusions for a reason. They're not based in reality. And also on that note, delusions are often caused by severe mental illness. Stuff that you can potentially get medication and help for. Not absolving this guy of the terrible thing he did though. Just saying that for whatever reason, in his mind, the world was not the way we see it. Story 48. It's interesting to think about, actually. He was in a relationship with a friend who was vulnerable, and he was very controlling and would make these impulse decisions that were irrational and weird. But he seemed like your typical insecure dude who found someone even more insecure to have control over. I'm glad we gently advised her to end the relationship, which she did. Not long after, the news was reporting the body in the barrel murder. They then found his body within a few days. He'd murdered his old boss and then took his own life a few days later. I guess the lesson in hindsight was his need to control. He had a zero tolerance for not getting his own way. He was literally a 20-something that would throw a tantrum if he didn't get what he wanted, and he never, ever compromised at all. Story 49. I used to know a forensic psychiatrist. He was in his late 80s. Still appeared as expert witness in court. A brilliant, funny man, but in some ways, chilling. The most frightening thing he ever told me was, "There is normally no difference between a murderer and you, except that one day they chose not to ignore the evil thoughts that most of us have. Who knows? One day, when you're angry enough, you might not ignore them either." On discussion, he admitted that there are some people with no empathy, no compassion, and total inability to consider anybody except themselves, but he maintained these were by far the minority of murderers. Most were ordinary people who were just pushed beyond normal boundaries. Story 50. My best friend growing up went down a road of heavy drug abuse. He couldn't keep a steady job, so the only way to feed the habit was to rob people, including my family, many times. After serving several years, though not his full sentence, he was released this summer. Apparently, years of prison did nothing, because he was arrested about a month ago for possession and identity theft. He apparently gave the police my name and address when they stopped him. It is actually disturbing because I've moved since he was locked up and have had no contact with him. The fact he was able to rattle off my new address doesn't sit well with me. We caught him casing our old house when he knew I was at work. Anyway, the police were obviously easily able to determine who he really was. A few days later, the local police department released a story stating he was being charged with the murder of a man found dead a couple of months prior. He was strangled to death in his home. While he did become a massive piece of garbage, I never would have suspected he would do something like that. He hasn't yet been convicted, but from the sounds of it, they have strong evidence against him. Story 51. I always knew something was off because he was seemingly always angry. I never thought he would take someone's life, though. He was the receptionist at my work. He was difficult with everyone, constantly complaining, didn't want to do any actual work, and was super passive-aggressive with everyone. It got to a point where I avoided him like the plague, which was difficult because he was the first person you would see when you walked into the office. Although he was responsible for basic tasks like making copies, providing work supplies, etc., I always did those things myself. One day I came in and he wasn't there. Someone told me he had been arrested for murder. Turns out he got into an argument with his ex-boyfriend, pulled out a gun from under his bed, and shot him. He claimed self-defense at trial, but the jury didn't buy it. This was in 2006. I just looked him up and he's up for parole in 2023. Okay, the way you're describing this person though, how did they ever get the job as a receptionist? Like, this is a very front-facing position where you interact with a lot of people, but you say he's passive-aggressive and difficult with everyone? Like, just straight up, doesn't sound like he was doing a good job. Story 52. I honestly didn't find him very creepy. He was a member of my night shift crew when I used to be a fast food manager, and while I never knew him well, he seemed like a quiet guy who laughed at the same inappropriate things everyone else on the closing/overnight shift did and smoked weed with everyone after work. My cousin, aka my mom's old best friend's kids that were always called my aunt/cousins while I was growing up, twin girls and a brother, ended up dating him, got pregnant, they got married. Shortly after, she was pregnant with their second kid and someone set fire to the family home, starting in the twin sister's room, but they thought it was her ex. She ended up moving in with her twin and the husband so she could feel safer. While the wife was in the hospital giving birth to the second kid, the husband left the hospital with the first kid in the back seat, went to their home, and assaulted and murdered the twin sister before going back to the hospital and acting like nothing happened. It's been 8 years, and I will never forget how unsettling it is to realize you've spent time with a murderer and never felt like something was off. off. Like, we weren't ever friends, but I never had the feeling that he was a murderer. Other people, I've had that unsettling feeling, but this time, it was honestly terrifying to realize how normal he seemed. Story 53. This kid I went to school with. He was a horrible person who did everything he could to aggravate the nicest teacher I had. I was only in one class with him, but from what I heard, he did things like that in every class. Constantly got suspended or just didn't show up for school. About 5 years after high school, he murdered and dismembered someone and disposed of the body parts in an open field. Another was a kid who rode the same bus home as me. Him and his buddies beat up a homeless man for literally no reason. He was out of jail for some reason and shot and murdered his pregnant girlfriend. Both terrible people who deserve life sentences. Story 54. I grew up with a kid that ended up torching a neighbor's house and murdering 4 people when he was 14, including 2 small children. I didn't really know him all that well, but because of the small town we lived in, we did hang out occasionally. As to when something was off, it wasn't really one event. I remember being astonished when he got caught skipping school in the 3rd grade. We were little kids and this absolute badass was walking around town by himself. From that moment on, he was labeled as bad and got in small amounts of trouble from time to time. He smoked, drank, and did drugs way before the rest of us even considered such things. Apparently, he was teaching one of the kids in the house how to use matches, and the father caught him. He went back that night, broke in, and set fire to the house. I knew the family he murdered pretty well and even watched the kids a few times when the parents had errands. It's a super sad story. He was sentenced to 8 consecutive life sentences without the possibility for parole. As far as I know, he is still the youngest person to be tried as an adult in our state. Story 55. I had an employee, big dude, about 6'5", 250 pounds, who seemed like a nice guy, but had an absolute jerk of a girlfriend who pretty much controlled him. She was so bad we had to ban her from the property. One Friday, dude runs his routes but can't make it back to the office in time to get paid for the week. No biggie, just pick up your check on Monday. He refused and offers to fax in copies of his run paperwork. That's against policy, so our payroll refuses. Next thing I hear is a commotion in the payroll office. He drove up and just went in there and started whooping everybody. I tried to jump in and he tossed me like a javelin too. I called the cops and we pressed charges, the whole 9. A few months later, I got a call from the local paper asking if I know so-and-so. I'm thinking they're asking about the assault case. Nope. Turns out dude's girlfriend left him. He stalked her and waited outside overnight. He knew she doesn't like turning on her car seats in the morning when it's cold, so she would ask her new boyfriend to do it. Well, he decapitated him and put his head by the body and took a load to Utah like nothing happened. They picked him up at a truck stop, chilling, waiting to pick up his next load. Story 56. For me, it was after the fact. My ex-husband courted me quite over the top in hindsight. He spun a lyrical tale of how our fates were connected and how we found each other at just the right time. I was foolishly smitten. After we'd moved in together and been engaged, he started talking about his job at the mental hospital before we met. I started realizing something was off about him, but he'd started slowly isolating me. He made me prioritize him, and it was a seamless transition. I was seeing my family less, talking to my friends was monitored, and he'd started getting weird in the bedroom, forceful, wanting me after I was crying, inconsolable from arguments, holding a pillow over my face, and he was constantly talking about owning a business for gun design with his brother, and about the torture chamber he would have to build and maintain in the basement. How, as his soon-to-be wife, I would be expected to never talk about what happened to men they had to work up, to never come into the basement, to never question what happened after the fact. But he told the story of going into the mental hospital and slamming a patient to the ground. It ended the patient's life. It was ruled an accident, but to hear him tell it, it was his first murder. He had fantasies about it before it happened, took a weird delight watching the light leave the eyes of the patient. He said he'd never slept so calmly in his entire existence. I later was moved to a cult farm at his insistence, and our marriage ended via text message after his attempts to reprogram me as his token black subservient wife failed. He tells the death story with this glossed over euphoria. I realize now, he's certifiable. There's something especially creepy to me about murderers who don't hide it at all. And I guess he kind of hid it, but at some point he just outright told OP all of this, like to their face. And not only that, he had an expectation that OP was just going to be cool with it, I guess? That's absolutely horrifying. OP, I am very glad you're out of there. That man is not all right. Story 57. I only know an attempted murderer, something I'm sure the victim is grateful for. She was a grad student who taught one of my undergrad classes, and we went out for lunch a few times after the class ended before she ghosted me. In any case, she ended up becoming obsessed with a coworker at the university she got a job at after she finished her PhD, and attempted one of those old love me or die type things. I didn't think she would ever go that far, but I knew there was something wrong when she said her favorite artist was Macklemore. I have no idea if this is a joke post or whatever, but I will take it because it is our last one for the day. And something a little lighter, not too bad after all this. A little disconcerting, the amount of posts in this thread that talked about how there weren't any signs that something was off or they didn't know. Especially that one a few stories ago where they talked about how murderers are just like you and me. It's just that one day they couldn't hold back those dark thoughts. I don't know, a little unsettling to me to say the least. For now though, thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day or night wherever you are, and I will see you in the next one.